Hello, folks at home. Today we are going to be taking a look at Season 1, Episode 3 of Game of Thrones, where we take a look at the first season and see what kind of foreshadowing elements there are and what kind of storytelling setup there is towards the end of the show. So, of course, there will be spoilers and a little bit of a change in format this week, just trying out something new, that rather than go through the episode chronologically, we're going to go through it geographically. So, if this messes up, don't worry, we'll change back to a more sensible format next week. But without further ado, Essos. Okay, so I think the thing that really... I don't have too many notes myself on... oh, hang on a minute, I forgot to do the introductions. I am, of course, Chris, and I am joined, as always, by Heather.
Hello.
So, let's crack on with Essos. So we have Jorah and the Khaleesi, Daenerys, of course. And I don't have too many notes in the way of the Essos scenes, but this is definitely where the scenes where she starts speaking differently. She starts, she starts realizing her own power here, and possibly even sort of questioning whether or not she has more power than her brother in this regard. And I think Jorah seems to think so, because he's definitely siding with Daenerys in terms of who he's counseling.
Yes. Well, I feel like that's what this whole scene is about, is her realizing that she's not as powerless as she thought she was. I love this scene. I feel like this is like the episode that made me fall in love with Game of Thrones. Like, the first few were just like, oh, this is kind of cool, and I like medieval stuff and like whatever. But like, this is the episode where, you really start to like it when we're going back to the chess game, right? Like the pieces are starting to move. And if we're going back to like the theme of coming of age, I feel like this like episode represents like their aha moment, like the children, like their collective, like, oh, okay, so this is what like being a grown-up is all about. You have it with Jon at the wall, you have it here, you have it with Robb being in charge of Winterfell, and like, Bran realizing that he's never gonna walk. It's like just like essentially everywhere in this episode. Like, it's like they're all just kind of like waking up and like realizing that action has consequences, and like this is like their first step into adulthood collectively.
Like because you were saying, particularly I think it was in episode 1, where like this is the status quo. And in episode 1 you saw the older characters, and there were sort of symbolic elements there. There was discussion about Bran being too young to see the guy get beheaded. There was Jon Snow's haircut, which I'm kind of almost illustrates that's the beginning of a new Jon. And now we've got here that Daenerys is starting to talk like a queen, and I think even Jorah says that, and she goes, "Not a queen, a Khaleesi." So yeah, definitely, this is like the beginning of their new characters. What separates them from Daenerys being at the was it the place with the red door? Is that what it's often referred to? Illyria Mopatis's place. I don't have this scene here, but I really like the scene where Daenerys's handmaiden comes out and sort of talks to Jorah and the other fella about her being pregnant. And it's, I don't know, to me this set up Jorah's character quite interestingly as well, because he does say, "Oh, I have to go," and I think Ian Glenn, just as an actor, does really good dialogue scenes. He just like, I don't know why, but I found like just he maybe it's his voice, maybe it's the way that the way that his dialogue is put together or what have you, but yeah, I just I just find him such a captivating actor even at that beginning stage. And as you're saying, for you that this is like the episode that made you fall in love with Game of Thrones, I think I'm actually inclined to agree, because you started knowing enough about the characters to sort of start building expectations around them.
Yeah. Going back to what you were saying about Jorah, it's like he's like the king of exposition. Like in
Yeah.
in this early, he was telling us all. He tells us all about like the Dothraki and all of that stuff.
Mhm.
But like I was thinking, I remember I wrote it down just like being silly that it's like I like this Jorah better than like whiny sick Jorah, like yeah,
Yeah.
because like yeah.
Actually, what's quite interesting about this as well is that even at this early stage, Jorah's painted as a decent guy, a likable person. But if you think about it, I mean, he sold people into slavery.
Uh-huh.
And there's a great video by another YouTuber called Grey Area, who made a video basically saying how like unjustified it is that Jaime seems to get so much hate for pushing Bran out of the window when there are so many other characters that who people consider to be good guys that do things that are as bad, if not worse. For example, Jorah sold people into slavery. Like he did that as a calculated move. Whereas I suppose not Jaime obviously wasn't pushing Bran out of the window for any kind of legitimate reason, but it wasn't like he did a premeditated thing for his own gain. He did it because he was covering up a conspiracy. And then, of course, later on, we see Jon Snow kill Ollie in the when after he got stabbed. And Ollie was that boy who his village got raided by wildlings. His parents were eaten by cannibals. He escaped to the Watch, and he had a grievance with Jon because Jon wanted to let the wildlings through the wall, the very same wildlings that killed Ollie's family and ate his parents. Ollie took it up with Jon. He listened. He heard his case. He listened him out. He even listened to Sam. Sam said, "We've got to listen to Jon. We've got to trust Jon," which obviously is a ridiculous thing to say because like if someone had killed your family, you and someone said, "Oh, but you have to understand that it's for the greater good," you wouldn't take that as a legitimate excuse. And it's not like Ollie was the first person to stab Jon. He was being he was being sort of grouped in with a bunch of men that felt similar. Had similar sentiments. And Jon had no problem whatsoever killing Ollie, and like the rest of the world was more than happy to see his head on a spike or his him hang from a noose. So I don't know. What is particularly interesting about this setup is how a lot of the characters commit very sort of serious serious ethical sins, as it were, but they get painted in entirely different ways. And I think it leads to the idea that this story is biased and written by someone. And if I was to go out on a limb, I would say that it would be Samwell Tarly. This story that we're seeing here through Game of Thrones is it seems that the characters that have treated Samwell Tarly the best are the ones that are portrayed in the most favorable light. And for example, Jorah. Sam really gets on with Jorah. Like, he saved Jorah's life in the Citadel. They're probably going to have some a lot of some scenes together in the next season where they're fighting the White Walkers off side by side. And of course Sam had a lot of respect for Jorah's father as well. So I just wanted to sort of put that in there as like, I don't know, I just feel that there is a lot of sort of biases, especially when it comes to Jorah's character. I mean, I love Jorah's character. I think he's played incredibly well, and his complexities are fantastic. But it's like, he's probably him. We're at the stage where we hate Jaime now, and I think the reason why we dislike Jaime or hate Jaime at this stage is not because he pushed Bran out of a window, but because he's arrogant and looks down his nose at everyone, and everyone hates people like that.
Yeah. See, like, I love handless Jaime. He's my favorite, probably. In the current iteration, I don't know. I love Jon Snow. I'm a huge fan of Jon Snow, but like other than that, I would have to say that handless Jaime is probably my favorite character. He's grown so much. The one thing I do want to say, like going back to like this is the first time that we see her like dressed as a Khaleesi as well, right? Like
Mm.
every time we've seen her before, she's been like wearing like the clothes of where she came from, and this is more her just like, you know, fitting in with her tribe and everything else, aside from this one pin that looks very similar to like the pin, the Hand of the King. So I just think it's really interesting because it's in the same kind of, it's pointing down sort of in a similar way to the way that Ned is wearing it in the same episode, and it's on the same side of her as it is of Ned. And it's, I don't know if that means anything, but it goes back to everything being deliberate. But like how we were talking last time about conception and how like the dragon eggs were like in the scene. Yeah, the one scene where she like decides that she's going to take control of whatever. They are again surrounded by candles in the scene where she's asked if she is pregnant. So, you know, and like these scenes are very clearly visually being tied to the dragon eggs. And that's like the second time.
Kind of get this idea that we sort of can maybe, it's not too tenuous a link to assume that the dragons and the White Walkers are linked, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that even the wall coming down was, a lot of it was by the design of the Night King himself. But whether or not possibly the resolution, the way to stop the Night King, would be to lay down your magical arms. Like if this is a new age of magic, and people are referring to, oh, dragons haven't been seen in thousands of years. Oh, the wall's been standing for thousands of years. Oh, we haven't seen, you know, anything beyond the, nothing's happened for 1,000 years. If you were to ask anyone about anything to do with magic, and I think even Nan makes a reference to it back at Winterfell. So the idea that dragons are being born, the idea that White Walkers are coming down, all of this happening at the same amount of time, is probably not a coincidence. So it could be the case that this entire story is resolved by laying down your arms, by killing the dragons and killing Bran, and possibly even the death of the last of the direwolves, because those are like the three most magical items, or the three they seem to be three sources of magic this side of the wall. And it could very well be that the magic this side of the wall is what attracts the White Walkers from the other side of the wall. And I just sort of imagine that a lot of what happens is that the story is going to start where it begins, and that Jaime might have to be the one to kill Bran for real. And it could very well be the case that the White Walkers might not have even ever invaded if Daenerys wasn't sold off to the Dothraki, and if Bran had died from falling out of that window. And if they, you know, if they maybe even never found the direwolves as well, you know, like if there were very, you know, if those very individual events didn't happen, and they could, or happen slightly differently, which, you know, just by chance could have, then none of this would have even come close to happening. But then again, I don't know. Like that is literally just a guess theory, and I don't have, you know, too much evidence to really back it up outside of the, you know, the story will come full circle, and that it will end in a very similar place to how it will begin, and that the final episode might have a huge number of similarities with the you know, the first few. Okay, so this is one of the early scenes in with the Stark's arrival at King's Landing, and this is such a symbolic scene because it is incredibly similar to the end of Robert's Rebellion, where Jaime stabbed the Mad King in the back. And at the end of Robert's Rebellion, Jaime was there sitting on the throne, and Ned came in. And a lot of people said that Ned could have sat on the throne, like he could have got Jaime to give up the throne for him, but Ned decided against it to let Robert sit on the throne. And it's interesting now that Jaime wasn't sitting on the throne as Ned entered, but was sitting on the steps in front of it. So there's a little bit of history repeating itself, but different, you know, a little bit of symbolism there. And I love that they opened with that, because it's a familiar scene, but played out significantly differently.
I noticed about the throne room while we're talking about it is that it's like dirty and empty, and nobody uses it, and nobody cares about it. And that is a real reflection um, of Robert's attitude.
Yes. We have the small council meeting as well.
Yeah, that was Exposition City.
Oh, yes. What did we learn? Well, we learned Peter Baelish's entire backstory. We were explicitly told about Robert's spendthrifting habits.
The notes I made about Peter are that like he's like less overtly shady, right? Like the performer did like a lot more to like kind of hide who he was and hide his intentions here in the beginning when we first meet him in comparison to like when he died.
I think this really turned out to get resolved, but it was about the 6 million the 6 million, what was it, gold dragons or whatever it was, that the crown was in debt. And I could have sworn at the time, and this is like my big theory completely fell apart in the last season, that I thought Peter Baelish was going to use that debt to destabilize the crown. And it almost worked, except for the fact that Cersei then just took the gold from the Tyrells and then gave it to the Iron Bank.
Yeah.
So, well done, Cersei. Foiled Peter Baelish's plan by stealing gold and giving it to the Iron Bank. So, which is quite good actually, because having the bank on your side, well, I would say out of all the forces in Westeros, I think the Iron Bank would be the one that I would want to go up against the least, because they have, deep pockets and will just spend and spend and spend until you're usurped, basically.
Yep. She seems to know what she's doing, Cersei.
Well, we do have a Cersei scene. This is a great scene. And it says so much more about Cersei than it does about Joffrey in a lot of ways.
Yeah. It's not, this scene is not about Joffrey at all. No. It is all about Cersei. And she says some like really important things, like someday you will sit on the throne and the truth will be what you make it. Which is something that we definitely see later from her. Also, like later on in this scene, she's talking about how a good king knows when to save his strength and when to destroy his enemies, and that the North cannot be held. These are all things that she says.
Yeah, and a lot of these are echoes from Tywin, because after the Red Wedding, of course, Tywin, he doesn't even really bother with the North. He hands it over to the Boltons, because they're really the only other family that were willing to go against the Starks and could, in theory, hold the North. And they would have won if it wasn't for so many other factors. Like, it was a very, there was a very slim chance that the Starks would have got Winterfell back. One of the things that Joffrey says that I really like, or one of the things that Joffrey says that I think is something that stuck with me, was he talks about his desire to have a standing army representing the entirety of Westeros, and that it's what did he say? He said that it's backwards to have have all these separate feudal lords having their own armies, and
that they should all serve the king.
Yeah, and I think Cersei might be taking that on as an idea, because Joffrey talks about professional, trained soldiers that are good at what they do, because a lot of these armies in Westeros, they're farmers that have had pikes stuck in their hands. And if you there's one of the in the spoken history of Westeros is one of the later ones, they talk about the War of the Ninepenny Kings, where there were armies of people of peasants who barely even knew what side they were fighting on, and they were just made to fight in these wars that were incredibly confusing. And I think that when we hear Cersei talk about bringing in the Golden Company, I think this is the professional standing army that we might actually see hold Westeros to come. And I think when the whole show wraps up and we're in basically the rebuilding stage, I think it will be that I think Westeros will have a full standing professional army, just like Joffrey just like Joffrey mentioned in this scene. And I think it is going to look like the Golden Company will be the beginnings of this. Okay. The final scene of the entire show here, we are introduced to Syrio Forel, one of my favorite characters, and Oh, so short-lived. He doesn't seem like a character native to King's. In fact, he seems like a character that hasn't yet been jaded by the politics of King's Landing, and probably in part because he is not, part of King's Landing. He was the first Sword of Bravos for 9 years, I think he says, which is actually quite interesting because last time I checked, the first Sword of Bravos position was a position for life. So I am one of those people who thinks that Syrio Forel was a faceless man, quite possibly Jaqen H'ghar in disguise. And the reason I think he's there, and I think, because it could very well be that Syrio Forel was once the Sword of Bravos, and he died, 9 years into his, 9 years into his role, and then was taken to the Faceless Men, where his face was then used by their assassins.
Mm-hmm.
And the Faceless Men do have an understanding of the politics of the world outside the House of Black and White. And, we see this with Jaqen H'ghar trying to get north, because, I assume that would be because the House of Black and White wants to understand the threat of the White Walkers, so they're sending an agent up there. And Jaqen H'ghar, of course, being skilled in, in the arts that the Faceless Men are skilled in, he'd go up, he'd presumably join the wall as a ranger and find out more and try and assess the threat. So it would make sense that they would also have an agent in King's Landing, where a lot of stuff was going down as well, so that they could have, eyes and ears essentially everywhere. So yeah, like being a training, being an instructor for a noble family in King's Landing would be the perfect cover for someone like Syrio Forel as a faceless man to actually find out a lot of information for them. So I think it makes a lot of sense that Syrio Forel is a faceless man here. But also, one of the things that I noticed is that he calls Arya a boy a few times, and then Arya responds by saying, "I'm a girl," which is the sort of nickname that Jaqen H'ghar gives Arya.
Yeah.
He keeps saying, "A girl knows this, a girl knows that," and I kind of get the feeling that's a little bit of a nickname, a little bit of a reference, and I'm not necessarily sure that all faceless men necessarily need to be as faceless as all that, because Arya effectively completes her training at the House of Black and White, and then she goes back up to Winterfell. Why, what's not to say that she, as Arya Stark, is an agent for the House of Black and White, as Arya Stark, fighting the White Walkers, like
House because of... like there's this whole thing about who are you, and she's like, I'm no one, and like when she actually like rebukes that and is like, I'm Arya, like he's actually happy about it.
Yeah, because that's the perfect identity that the House of Black and White need to deal with the White Walkers, to have an agent up there, maybe even fighting for them. And what I would love to see, what would be so cool, is if the Battle of Winterfell or wherever the battles take place, that the Faceless Men join in, like they show up, and they're part of the fighting force. Maybe even like they could, like the Faceless Men against the White Walkers. How cool would that be?
The thing about this scene is at the very end when Ned is watching and he's smiling, and but then all of a sudden, like, you get like you start hearing like the clang of like actual swords, right? And like my question about that is like, is that PTSD or is it foreshadowing? Oh, Tyrion. Again, like going back to my whole, like, this is the episode where I fell in love with this show. Like, this is the scene where, you really see Tyrion for the first time, and how like he uses humor as a weapon, and like how he's actually very clever, and like it's just, he's just been a drunken imp up until this point. But I feel like he says a lot of very significant things in this discussion. Where are my notes on this?
I've got another still with him having a chat with Jon Snow.
This was great. Like, I just feel like he literally just went to the wall just so he could pee off it. And that's like the very last thing he does before he leaves is like piss off the wall. And I'm like, oh, Tyrion, I love you.
Yeah, and I think this seems particularly important because they don't see each other again for, well, until season 7. So, and they leave on good terms, which is
Yes.
important. Now, you spotted a real good one here.
Yes.
The crow.
Yes. Like mind you, he's like the three-eyed raven, right?
Mm.
Not a crow. Like they're different birds. But like the thing that I thought that was really interesting is like right after this, she says something like, never you mind, or like don't listen to him, all crows are liars. Which I thought was interesting because like that is what the wildlings call the Night's Watch. So if all crows are liars, does that mean that the three-eyed raven is a liar? And, you know, does that mean Bran is a liar later? Like, does he really see the truth? Does he really see everything? Like, you know, it's a very weighted statement, that's for sure.
Absolutely. In fact, I did think that, you know, obviously because Bran wargs into ravens, you know, does that mean he shouldn't, you know, that what he sees when he's walking into ravens is not a true representation of what's actually happening? But when he's going back to when he was in the cave and learning to be, you know, learning about his green sight and learning about all the time travel stuff, one of the definitive statements that the three-eyed raven makes is that you can't change the past. You know, is it like you can't rewrite history? The ink is already dry, and that I you know, could that be the lie that Old Nan is referring to? That you can change the past, and it's definitely a weighted statement.
Mm-hmm. And it's more than just a throw off from a crazy old lady.
Yeah, basically, I think she might be just making reference to the narrative that the crows or the Night's Watch are there to keep the wildlings out,
Mm-hmm.
and that's obviously not the truth. I
Yeah.
think that's what I would peg it at, is that it's like it's a foreshadowing that the wildlings are actually not the enemy. Probably my favorite episode so far, because we do start getting into the stride of the characters.
The story just like progressively gets quicker from this point forward, and things start amping up, and like everything just goes down in King's Landing and whatever, you know. So it's like this is the beginning of the end, essentially.
Yeah, this is when the show starts moving forward. Like the last 2 episodes were establishing the characters as they were, and now they're sort of beginning their journey of character development and plot development.
Yeah, well, because like all characters have to grow, right? Like, or it's not satisfying for the audience. Like, if the characters never change, if they never learn anything through their experience, that's like extremely, you know. So, but in order to see where they're going, we have to see where they were, you know. And this is the first, like you were just saying, the first time we depart from where they were to where they're going, really.
So yeah, that was episode 3 in season 1. Yeah, cracking episode. So that's about it from us today. Until next time, toodaloo.
Bye.